Hello again, this is Divine Erdrick, and it's time to geek out some more over Path of Exile. So, we have a bit of an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. Well, maybe not so much an elephant as a gigantic muscular demon. Yeah, it's time. It's time to do the age-old question of Path of Exile versus Diablo III. So many people have tackled this particular question before, and most of the time you get a non-committal answer of, well, they're different games. You know, very different games for different experiences and different audiences. And yeah, that's true, and I would tend to agree with that, but they're also both action RPGs. But there's something about Path of Exile that I think needs to be brought a little bit more to the forefront. And that is the other giant muscle-bound demon in the room. And that's Diablo II. See, I've said before that I honestly believed that vanilla Diablo 3, not Reaper of Souls, the actual at-launch vanilla Diablo 3, minus Era 34, was actually a good game. It was just extremely disappointing in comparison to Diablo 2. So, where does that put us then when we're talking about Path of Exile versus Diablo 3 if we don't actually acknowledge Diablo 2? So as I compare these two games, I'm not just going to compare them to each other. I'm going to compare them to Diablo 2 as well. And it's my belief Path of Exile is the better follow-up to Diablo 2. So if you're a Diablo fan, as in someone who played classic Diablo and Diablo 2, and you haven't tried Path of Exile yet, I would strongly urge you to give Path of Exile a try, because I think I'll be able to demonstrate during this video that Path of Exile really is the game you're looking for. It is the Diablo 3 you were looking for that Blizzard failed to deliver. So first, let's take a look at the basic philosophy between the two games. Diablo 3, many people have described it as a casual game. Again, I think that the vast majority of gamers really don't appreciate or understand where the actual true hardcore versus casual distinction is. There definitely is a group of people out there, an audience out there, that all they want to do is pick up a video game now and then to sit down and relax and just blow off a little steam. And there's definitely an audience out there that is willing to put a large amount of time and investment into their video games. But the games themselves usually don't break down along those lines. Diablo 3 really isn't a casual experience. It is an experience that was aimed at gamers. In particular, it was aimed at the growing community of action RPG gamers that had started and begun to flourish with games like Diablo II, Guild Wars, Sacred, the Dark Alliance series, and was continuing to just kind of peter along until we get to games like Torchlight. But it's very obvious, looking at Diablo 3, that they were trying as much as possible for a mass market gamer appeal as well. And again, that does not mean casual gamers. It just means they wanted to sell to as many customers as possible. And yes, that would have included some casuals, but it also just would have included gamers that dedicated most of their time to other games. In particular, they were very interested in taking the growing fandom around Blizzard that had started with World of Warcraft and being able to get them to buy into Diablo 3 as well. And you can definitely see that they still managed to hook in a hardcore audience when you look at the sheer number of people who still come back to the seasons every season and still try to push those higher and higher greater rifts. So they did manage to pull in a decent community of hardcore gamers that are still very dedicated to the game. So that mass market appeal that they were going for, I think really changed the direction of many systems in the game, and really changed how the game eventually ended up feeling compared to its predecessor. Now let's look at Path of Exile. Path of Exile was aimed specifically at classic action RPG, computer RPG gamers. The gamers that had played the original Diablo and Diablo II. Gamers who had played games like Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale. Gamers who had become used to a certain level of depth and difficulty that was particularly well known in the PC gaming sphere, where console games had kind of eschewed. And Path of Exile really tried to hone specifically in that audience, and then once it found its audience, it has tried very hard, and Grinding Gear Games has done an admirable job of being exceptionally responsive and caring towards that audience. So keeping that in mind, let's take a look at Diablo II and some of the hallmarks that it held as a game. Diablo II isn't just a classic action RPG or a classic computer RPG. It's one of the genre-defining action RPGs, computer RPGs. It's one of the games that gamers look back on to show this is what that genre was capable of, and this is what that genre did back in the day. So that genre was known for a few things right from the get-go. 1. Full-on hardcore experience. We're going to make a game, it's going to have the mechanics we want, the gameplay we want, and the difficulty that we set. And then the players are going to either accept it or they're not going to accept it. So the community that developed around Diablo II, they were a community that was already looking at that game going, I'm either going to like this game and I'm going to spend a lot of time and energy on it, or I'm not going to like this game and I'm going to find another game. That's a kind of mindset that doesn't exist in the AAA space anymore. Maybe there's a couple of studios that are willing to take that risk, but for the most part, AAA studios want everyone to play their game. Everyone to spend their money. So if there's a chance that you might look at their game and say, nah, this one's not to my liking, they're going to avoid making that game. So Path of Exile already has a bit of the leg up. The game also had a very specific feel to it. It's often been described as this gothic feel, this dark, depressing, claustrophobic atmosphere, an almost horror-like pall over everything, and a story that is this real, desperate struggle against all odds. And then you look at Diablo III, and then in addition to obviously trying to have as much mass market appeal as possible, they completely changed the feel of the game. The game has a feel that's obviously aimed much more towards the mainstream gamer, and it has more of a power fantasy element to it, as opposed to Diablo II, where you're playing these heroic individuals whose heroism is marked more by what they're risking than what their capabilities are. In Diablo III, you're playing the Nephilim, a newly birthed member of a reborn race in the wake of the destruction of the World Stone, that according to legend has powers to have rivaled anything seen in creation. That's a completely different feel and fantasy than this struggle for survival. But let's stop talking in abstract for now. Let's actually go breaking it down. Well, we'll go point by point, comparing Diablo III and Path of Exile. And we'll also add Diablo II into these comparisons, except for the first two, because we're going to go over the ones that aren't fair first. There's two comparisons that can be made that are pretty one-sided. One in favor of Diablo III, the other in favor of Path of Exile. And it's determined by the nature of the studios that made them and the type of games they are. So the first not fair aspect is the technical ones. Activision Blizzard is not only a AAA publisher, they are one of the most powerful and wealthy organizations in the video game space right now. They had all of the resources, manpower, and experience necessary to make Diablo 3 the most technically proficient game that it could be. Can't really argue against that. When it comes to graphics, sound, tightness of the control, stability of the Battle.net servers, Diablo 3 wins. As grinding gear games has gotten more in the way of resources, the controls and sound and visuals and effects on Path of Exile have improved. But they're still trailing a little bit behind where Diablo 3 is. On the other side of the not fair equation, you have content. Diablo 3 was a single boxed release initially at $60 price point. As a free-to-play game, Path of Exile depends on constantly releasing new content to keep their players coming back and spending money on their microtransactions and their Founders Packs. Because of this and how long Path of Exile's been out, because essentially it officially released in beta not long after Diablo 3 did, there is a lot of content in Path of Exile. Diablo 3 has had one expansion and a few big patches that included new areas to it. Path of Exile, basically once every quarter or so, has had new maps and content added. So there's a huge imbalance in content, and with it kind of a huge imbalance in value, because Diablo 3 is still a priced release where I think at this point you can get Diablo 3 and Reaper of Souls for like $50 or $40, but still you're comparing that to Path of Exile with all of the content that it's had come out since 2013 for free. Yeah, so that's not a fair comparison either. And trying to compare either to Diablo 2 at this point is also kind of silly, since Diablo 2 came out in 2000, so 18 years ago. So the standards for releases didn't really exist back then the way they do now. In fact, the whole free-to-play marketplace really didn't exist back then. The closest we had was there was still a little bit of a freeware community. So let's go over what we can actually compare about the games, so that we can start actually seeing where you can actually decide which game you would want to play more of, as well as which game is a better follow-up to Diablo 2. So let's go point by point, and let's start with one selling point for any RPG, the characters. In Diablo 2, we had 5 characters on release, and then 2 more were added in Lord of Destruction for a total of 7. Now, each of these characters played completely and totally differently. However, they were otherwise not very customizable, and for the most part were also kind of unique from each other, with unique appearances and feels and voice lines. Now, there wasn't a lot of voice lines for the characters in Diablo 2, but the ones that did exist did give each of them a very unique personality that separated them in addition to gameplay mechanics. When we go to Diablo 3, once again, we get 5 characters on the initial release, then we got a 6th character in Lord of Destruction, and then finally they released the 7th character, the Necromancer, as the Necromancer DLC pack. And here we see, first of all, them taking those individual personalities and just cranking them up to 11. The characters in Diablo 3 are much more vocal. you get a lot more lines from them during gameplay, and then, basically in Diablo 2, you got a handful of lines when they entered specific areas. In Diablo 3, different gameplay things going on will also cause the characters to speak, such as when you level up, or when you complete one of the little bonus achievements for bonus XP or effects, such as, killing a ton of monsters in one hit. And then, to further identify them, the characters narrate their own story. So not only do you have more dialogue from the characters during gameplay, but you get to see what the characters themselves feel and think during their story. And then one final note that we can make on Diablo 3's characters is that they are much more customizable than Diablo 2's characters were. Unlike Diablo 2, each character is not assigned a gender. When you play a character in Diablo 3, you can choose to play them as either male or female. Additionally, you can obtain dyes for your gear to customize the look of your character inside the game. This is something that Diablo 3 has up on Path of Exile for, since changing your appearance in Path of Exile requires using microtransactions. But again, paid game versus free-to-play. So even though they kind of set them up as unique characters, they also set them up as characters you could very highly customize. And those two things don't always play well together, but I'll be honest, in Diablo 3's case, it kind of works. Now when we look at Path of Exile is a lot more like Diablo 2 here. You have 6 characters that were created on release, and then you had a 7th character that you could unlock through gameplay, which is one of those things that I think interestingly separates Path of Exile from other free-to-play games, because you did not buy your 7th character. Even Diablo 3 makes you buy your 7th character. No, in this free-to-play game, you got your 7th character initially by unlocking it through gameplay, by getting to the boss of Act 3. Now, you don't even have to do that. You load up Path of Exile and the Scion is available right from the get-go. And again, like Diablo 2, each of these characters has very unique backgrounds, histories, and personalities, and they're conveyed through a handful of lines that the character says throughout the story. Initially, the character background was read by themselves, but after Fall of Oriath, now at the character select screen, you get this sequence where Dominus actually sentences the character and explains why they're being exiled or A-classed. Now, as far as customizability, without spending any money, the main customizability for your characters is their playstyle. The character classes in Path of Exile are far more open than they are in other action RPGs. Any character has access to any skill, but because of how the characters are set up still, 2 characters using the same skill will still play somewhat differently, or at least need to make certain adjustments in order to use that skill as effectively as other characters might be able to use it. And there are definitely best characters for specific skills. So right off the bat, the style of characters is more similar in Path of Exile to Diablo 2 than Diablo 3. But the differences are very, very fine, and arguably getting more personality out of your character, the way Diablo 3 does, is still an improvement over just having an occasional line and then some backstory, like Path of Exile does. But speaking of backstories, let's actually talk about the story, because here is where we start to see a huge split-off between the intentions that were set in Diablo 2 into Diablo 3 and where Path of Exile decided to go. So Diablo 2's story was a race against time story. It was one of those desperate, tense stories where it seemed like at any moment, any chance of victory could be lost. And in a way, it kind of does happen that way. Obviously, spoiler warning for a game that's 18 years old. the whole story revolves around chasing down the Dark Wanderer, who is Diablo taking human form. And the Wanderer's goals is to release his brothers, Baal and Mephisto, from imprisonment, and then combine the three of them will wreak havoc upon Sanctuary. So you're trying to stop this from happening, and again, spoiler alert, you fail. You do not stop the primevals from waking, and instead, you have to basically try to recover what has happened after they have been unleashed. You slay Mephisto, you slay Diablo, and then in Lord of Destruction you slay Baal after he has already all but destroyed the barbarians, and after he has tainted the World Stone to the point where the World Stone needs to be destroyed, with repercussions to be determined later, as they show in Diablo 3. Now, we go on to Diablo 3, and Diablo 3's story is, well, kill the big bad evil guy. It starts off with a little bit of mystery as to what's going to happen, but even then, this mystery portion is a fairly short Act 1 setup of a traditional narrative, where you're meeting your characters, you're getting to know who your character is, you're getting to know Leah, you're getting to know Deckard Cain again, you're getting to know Tyrael in his new form. Again, spoilers for Diablo 3 if you haven't played Diablo 3 yet. But essentially, after that initial period, you discover that there is a plot by the Lesser Evils to invade the world of Sanctuary, the remaining two Lesser Evils being Belial and Asmodan. And then it's all about chasing down Belial and Asmodan, and you defeat them, get betrayed, Diablo is reborn as the primeval, you then kill Diablo. And here's the thing, Diablo and Asmodan both wreak a lot of havoc, and in fact, Belial also wreaks a lot of havoc. You basically stop them before they really fully implement their scheme. So there's a much more traditional finale there with Diablo 3. The only kind of loose end is that at the end of vanilla Diablo 3, the Black Soul Stone plummets to Earth, is later obtained by Malthael, and then Malthael destroys Westmarch, and you then have to destroy Malthael. But even then, there's a bit of a difference there, because in Diablo 2, you were still fighting while there was still hope. I mean, yes, when you get to the Rogue's Monastery has already been destroyed. But you're still in this position where it still feels like you might have a chance. Even with the Lord of Destruction, there still seems to be this chance, like if you can just get through everything fast enough, you can stop Baal. When you begin Reaper of Souls, Malthael's already destroyed Westmarch. There is no race against time there, it's just, well, Malthael's destroyed Westmarch, now we're going to kill Malthael. So it's a much different kind of story. And the fantasy of the whole story is different. It's a grander, comic book almost kind of feel, with this whole idea that, you're playing these powerful Nephilim characters. So now we go to Path of Exile. Well, Path of Exile's story is a fight for survival. You are exiled to the land of Rayclass, the cursed continent, a continent that has brought down empires with the cataclysms that have occurred there. And I'm not going to go into as much detail with Path of Exile because, well, this is meant to try to convince you to play Path of Exile, so I don't want to ruin the story for you. But needless to say, this fight for survival and this journey to try to return to Oriath and escape the cursed continent, yeah, bad stuff happens. It's a much more darker, more Pyrrhic, more destruction-filled story than Diablo 3, which is all about just killing the bad guys. So although it's a different kind of story than Diablo 2, it still feels like that dark struggle style story, you know, the race against time, the struggle for survival. These are stories that imply that your character is essentially always having to fight to even have a chance. Whereas with Diablo 3, victory feels a lot more certain, and even your character treats victory as far more certain than the characters in Diablo 2 and Path of Exile. But now we can get into the nitty-gritty of how that story and those scenes are portrayed, and we'll start with art. So Diablo 2 and Diablo itself started with these very dark, washed out pastel palettes, you know, very desaturated colors. And dungeons and even many of the outdoor areas, they all felt dark and claustrophobic. Like the darkness itself was kind of pushing in against you at all times. There was a mechanic called light radius that existed in Diablo 2 that they didn't include in Diablo 3 that determined just how much your character's presence pushed the darkness back. And this created a very tense, creepy atmosphere. And it meant you had to pay close attention and that you'd occasionally hear monsters you couldn't necessarily see. Diablo 3 completely did away with that. Now, many people have described Diablo 3 as cartoony, and I don't think that's fair. I don't think Diablo 3 actually feels cartoony. But it is a much more bright and vibrant game. The colors are much truer, they're much richer, and the screen never feels dark. You always have full vision of everything around you. And to be honest, what it feels like is it feels like your average AAA video game. Which is not to actually say that that's a bad thing in and of itself, because allowing the screen to be that readable, allowing it to be so that you can see everything around you, it gives you more options in terms of gameplay for choosing how you will approach each encounter. Now, Reaper of Souls did a lot to try to bring back that older feel. The color palette in Reaper of Souls is a lot more washed out than the original vanilla color palette is. Westmarch feels a lot darker, feels a lot more cramped. It's still very readable, very gameplay-focused visuals, but it did manage to bring a little bit of that feel back. But Path of Exile has had it to start with. They immediately started with that same kind of dark, washed-out, desaturated color palette. They made sure that dungeons and a lot of other areas feel dark and claustrophobic. They brought the light radius mechanic back in, and then they tied it to your character's health. So the more danger your character is in, the more the darkness feels like it's closing in around you. All of these things help, again, reinforce that dark struggle to survive story. Now, let's talk about music. Diablo 2, which had an absolutely amazing musical score, one of the true models of how you can use video game music, had mostly single or small group instrumental pieces. And most of the songs had this haunting or mournful feel, and when they needed to punctuate the action, they usually did it with some bass or some percussion, you know, dark, thuming, thrumming music. And then you get to Diablo 3, and it's all sweeping orchestral suites. I mean, just loading up Diablo 2 versus Diablo 3, you can feel the difference in the kind of sound they're going for. I mean, the opening to Diablo 2 is about as cinematic feeling and sweeping as the music gets, and even then, it's not this grand affair. It's a few winds and strings, and again, the more epic pounding pieces of music are all in lower registered notes. Whereas you load up Diablo 3 and just right off the bat, it is bringing you into this huge orchestral piece with all of these different leitmotifs going on, and it's just a completely different feel, and you can tell they wanted you to feel power and grandeur while you were playing the game. You go on the Path of Exile, and once again, they're bringing in those single or smaller group instrumentals. They're bringing back kind of that haunted feel to the sound. They do still bring out those more orchestral pieces, but they use them only to punctuate specific moments and specific boss fights. But now let's talk about gameplay. So Diablo II's gameplay was a very weighty, committed, and punishing gameplay. Moves had a sense of commitment to them. You had a stamina bar, which prevented you from necessarily being able to run away when you needed to. You didn't really have any escape moves or rollaways. When you made an attack, you kind of had to commit to that attack, and it was very possible to overcommit or miscalculate and die. Diablo III, again, going for more of that AAA mass market gamer appeal, has much tighter and more responsive combat. It rarely feels like any one move has overcommitted you in Diablo 3. Now, it's possible to overcommit as in, jump into a pack of monsters and die, but as a general rule, the controls allow you to change your gameplay and your strategy on a dime. At a moment's notice, you can switch up what you're trying to do. You can go from going on offense to on defense. There are dodge moves and mobility moves that really help you move around and escape certain types of attacks. On the consoles, there's literally a dodge that your character can do. And many people have described this combat as feeling kind of floaty. But that's because that fine-tuned control removes that sense of weight. If you're not planting your feet to attack, like you had to in Diablo II, it makes it feel like your attacks are actually separate from your movement. That's what creates that floaty feel. But again, the whole goal there is it's trying to give gamers tight, responsive combat, and it succeeds wonderfully. Like I said, the combat in Diablo 3 is very satisfying. Path of Exile goes back to that weighted, committed combat. Your character plants their feet to attack, they plant their feet to cast spells. You have a lot of skills that can't be interrupted once you've started them. You have what's called name locking, where if you keep using a skill or spamming a skill, your character will keep attacking the target you name locked. They literally won't let up no matter what you do until you stop for that moment to get the name lock clear, and then you can move away or do whatever. And although there are dodge type moves that exist, because of how committed each attack feels, the dodge type moves need to be used with thought. And it's still very, very easy to overcommit and miscalculate and die because of it. So now we're actually into gameplay, and you can start to see that the gameplay in Path of Exile is far, far closer to Diablo 2 than Diablo 3's gameplay is. Alright, now let's talk about progression. And this is the one thing that Jay Wilson really pushed into a AAA progression game space that I think really sells out Diablo 3. It is the one main failing that Diablo 3 has, and they've tried to recover it, but in my opinion, it's all band-aids using duct tape, spit, and a prayer to try to give the game any sense of progression at this point. And for some people, what they've created still works for them, but the fact that I almost always lose interest in Diablo 3 as I continue to grind away in endgame, whereas in Path of Exile, that's where my interest really tends to swell. I think it emphasizes just how bad that initial progression is, even with the changes brought by Reaper of Souls. So Diablo 2's progression used a character point and skill tree progression. Every time you leveled up, you got 5 character points, and you got 1 skill point. And there were other ways, such as through quests, to get these character points and skill points. But mostly you got them through leveling up. And you had to split the 5 character points between 4 stats. And then that 1 skill point had one of 3 skill trees you could put it into. And then later on in the 1.10 patch, they changed the skill trees up so that the skill trees weren't as separate as they were before, using the synergy system, allowing your points to have a little bit more weight to them. But one aspect of the skill point and stat system was that you could create versions of each character that played very, very differently. You could create versions of each character. In fact, you always had versions of your character that did not have access to all of the skills. At least not if you wanted a playable character, which brings us to the fact you could screw a character up. My first character in Diablo 2 could not survive Nightmare because I didn't build him properly. And in the original version of Diablo 2 and Lord of Destruction, when that happened, you started over. If you screwed a character up, you made a new character. Now, towards the end of Diablo 2's life cycle, they eventually answered the fans' desire to not let one misspent skill point ruin a character. And they gave you the ability to respec. But they limited it. You had 3 respecs you got through playing through the story. Every time you beat the Den of Evil in normal Nightmare and Hell, you got a respec point that you could use to reassign your skill points. And then it was possible to earn additional respec points. And those earned respec points involved items, which meant you could trade for those items in-game amongst the community. But although this system made it possible to ruin a character, the end result was there were many, many viable builds for each character class in Diablo 2. They were still best in class, and in fact there were overall best builds, things like Hammerden, for example, but there were still lots and lots of fun builds to try and play. But even if you could not solo the Tristram event with your character, there was usually still enjoyment to be had with a character using one of these different playstyles. Diablo 3 completely scrapped this system and replaced it with a system that essentially has no progression to it. In Diablo 3, you get access to all of your skills. All of your skills, all of their runes, all of the passives. You get access to all of them. You get them essentially for free as you play through the game leveling up. There's no picking or choosing them, you just get them. Then your build is created by picking 6 of those active skills and 4 passive skills, and that becomes your build. Eventually, they tried to tack on a progression system with the Paragon point system, but it feels very tacked on, and one of the reasons that Jay Wilson said he scrapped the character point system was that changing your stats with your character points, where you invested those stats, was a no-brainer. And he's correct. With the exception of a handful of builds, every single character in Diablo 2 used the same stat allocation. Enough strength for gear, enough dex for gear, and or enough dex for max block, no points in energy, everything into vitality. But the Paragon system's not any better. The fans had essentially cracked the best way to use the Paragon system literally within a week of it being released. And then they added the ability to basically change your character at almost any time. The only time you can't change your character is when you are already in combat or inside a rift. So you're never locked into a choice. With Loop 2.0 and Reaper of Souls, they further augmented this system by giving you a new progression system added completely off of your gear. Now your build is determined by your gear. In Diablo 2, your gear was determined by your build. There were best in slot gear, but you also had a lot of other things that you could do. Now you get specific sets to create specific builds. And there are variations on each set's build, but that's how you create your character in Diablo 3. You pick the build from the different gear sets. To make matters worse, for most of Diablo 3's history, only a handful of builds have ever been best builds. Now, to be fair, there have been lots and lots of viable builds out there, because since you can change the content challenge, you can use whatever build you think is fun and just keep playing the game that way. But if you're actually trying to push for higher greater rift levels, well, there's specific builds that you can use. Now, to their credit, the Diablo 3 team has done an amazing job of trying to keep the game balanced so that more and more builds become endgame viable for pushing those higher level greater rifts. And now there is, if you're a Diablo 3 fan, I gotta say, there's a lot of reasons to play Diablo 3 right now with all of the viable builds for greater rift pushing. But even then, there are still best builds for it. And since greater rifts are determined not just along the lines of each season, but along each lines of each character, not only are certain characters always topping the season leaderboards, but certain builds will top the greater rift leaderboards for each character. Path of Exile also decided to basically scrap this attribute point system in favor of a pure passive skill tree. Here, Path of Exile decides to completely deviate from all action RPGs. What Path of Exile does instead is it makes all of the skills your character can use gems that you can purchase or find in the game. And then you use these skill gems combined with a support gem system, which I'll go into further detail in a later video, to create the character that you want to create as far as their skills are concerned. And then as you level and complete quests, you get skill points to put into a passive skill tree that makes your character more effective in the style of play that you want them to engage in. And that is something I'm definitely going to have to cover in a whole nother video, because that is another big bugbear, is that massive skill tree we call skill drossel. But the end result is that there are lots and lots of ways that you can play your characters. There are just so many things you can do in Path of Exile, creating unique and interesting characters. And although gear-enabled builds exist, once again, most of the time, it's the other way around. The build you're playing determines your gear. And because of how much gear variety there is, it's a lot harder to claim the best in slot, and it's usually always possible to find an even better piece of gear for your character. Yes, certain builds will definitely require certain unique items in order to see their absolute optimal performance. But for most builds, they only need 1 or 2 uniques in order to function properly. And for the rest of the gear, you're just trying to get the best stats to further push that gear's damage and survivability. Path of Exile does, however, follow Diablo 2's tradition in that you can completely screw up a character. My first Path of Exile character did a lot better than my first Diablo 2 character, but it was not capable of facing red maps, and it was not capable of facing Shaper. In fact, the vast majority of the endgame super bosses, my first Path of Exile character could not face them. To help counter this, though, you can respec in Path of Exile. Respec points are earned by questing. Throughout the main story, you'll get a handful of respec points to help fine-tune your character later, and you can get them in drops and trade for them. And I'll go into a lot more detail on that when I talk about Path of Exile's currency and crafting system. But because of all of the potential that exists in Path of Exile's skill and skill tree system, again, you have so many viable builds. Now, again, not all builds work for everything, and not all builds are capable of farming the super bosses. And there are definitely best builds. There are builds that are far more powerful than your average build. But the number of builds in Path of Exile is just extraordinary. And the community is constantly tinkering and finding new ways to play the game, and new builds to try and have fun with. So even if the system is different, the end result is much, much closer to what Diablo 2 was trying to accomplish regarding viable builds and best build. Now, speaking of gear and builds, let's talk about gear. let's talk about the itemization in these three games. So Diablo II's loot pursuit was all about best-in-slot gear. It was all about figuring out what the best type of item was for any given slot on your character, and then trying to find the best version of that item you could find. To help with this, Diablo II had a crafting and rune system that allowed you to collect certain items as you played to then use to try to make the best gear you could make. Inevitably, some of the best in slots would turn out to be just plain old unique items that you would find, or set items that you would find. In some cases, the best item was actually just to find a good rare with the right stats on it for your character. And to help with this, you could trade your items. You could trade your items for gold and, of course, Stone of Jordans. Good old SOJs. And the community and the trading aspect of the community was vibrant. It required a little bit of skill to navigate, but you could still do it. So then we go to Diablo III. And I'm not going to talk about itemization prior to Loot 2.0. Vanilla Diablo III itemization should only be discussed as part of learning the history of how the AAA industry has gotten progressively greedier and greedier to the detriment of the games they are releasing. But Loot 2.0 introduced a new progression mechanic for creating and developing your builds, and for progressing through endgame content. And I mentioned it before when I was talking about the progression differences between the three games, but that mechanic is that your gear determines your build. And itemization in endgame, which is all that really matters in Diablo 3 currently, and in fact it's all that matters in most action RPGs now, itemization is all about finding better versions of the same gear. Your gear's already been determined, now you're just looking for the better stats. And they even actually came up with new tiers as the seasons have progressed to hunt for. Starting, of course, was when Loot 2.0 came out. It was all about legendary items. Later on, they introduced Ancients, which are a better version of those legendary and set items. And now you have the Primal Ancient items. And each one is progressively harder to find, and each one requires more grinding and trying to get the best version of that gear for your build that you can get. To make matters worse, all you can do is grind it. That's it. If you're playing in parties, you might mention briefly at the beginning of playing in a party, hey, I'm looking for this particular item. Particularly good players or inexperienced players might actually keep an eye out just based on what your build is to try to find those good items for you. But at the end of the day, it's just running rift after rift after rift, bounty after bounty, trying to get that Primal Ancient with the right stats. Path of Exile is about best in slot. Just like Diablo II, Path of Exile is about looking for the best item you can for each specific slot for your build. Again, your build is determining what items you should be looking for versus your items, your gear, determining your build. And just like Diablo II, there is an extremely active and hardy trading community. And they are fantastic, and the tools that have been developed to help with trading in Path of Exile makes trading a very satisfying experience for the most part. It's got some ups and downs, but trading in Path of Exile is far and away better than what it was in Diablo II. And then on top of trading, you have Path of Exile's crafting system. And Path of Exile's crafting system is just an entirely different animal than most other games out there. And it's a lot of fun to play and tinker with. And I'm going to do crafting in its own video later. But let's just put it for now that what is often referred to as big boy crafting can be exciting and cool and can create some really interesting results. But a lot of these talks of itemizations are focused around endgame. And we should talk about the leveling and the endgame for each game, realizing that the idea of endgame content is something that was mostly started in the early 2000s thanks to World of Warcraft. So it's more recent of an idea than Diablo 2 is. So looking at Diablo 2, Diablo 2 is all about the leveling push. That is the focus of Diablo 2. It is all about that run to 99. And the community got to the point where essentially it was circumventing the main story content. Because, well, by the time you're laddering a lot in Diablo 2, you've played through that main story content so many times. I mean, remember, the progression from Diablo 2 and what started for vanilla Diablo 3 is you play the same story over and over and over to get to the highest levels. Eventually, in later patches, as endgame started becoming more of a thing that players cared about, Diablo 2's patches introduced actual endgame content. Things you could only do in the endgame after you'd reached Hell, and things that you more than likely could not accomplish until you were pushing those higher levels for your character with the better gear for your character. Things like Uber Diablo and the Tristram event. Those were essentially the only endgame that Diablo 2 had, and again, it was introduced in patches. So again, not talking about vanilla Diablo 3, because Diablo 3 endgame originally is, again, part of that sad story of how greed is ruining our video games, unfortunately. Reaper of Souls endgame is very open-ended. It's all about being able to try to keep pushing for higher and higher levels of power. It starts at level 70, essentially. By the time you have defeated the campaign, or by the time you actually start trying to push greater rifts, you will want to be at level 70 so you can get level 70 gear, as opposed to just running the same content over and over on different difficulty settings one after another. Difficulty is now just an option slider that you can adjust as your character grows in power. And although there are some challenges that you can try to attempt to show the skill of your character and the power of your character, such as the challenge rifts, the majority of endgame is focused on greater rift pushing. That is the goal. The goal is to try to see how far you can push that number. And I think for a lot of people, they really enjoy that open endgame. It's like pushing a high score. It speaks to something very innate in the gamer nature, to always want to do better, to go a little bit further and beat your own best constantly. And that brings us to Path of Exile's endgame. In my opinion, Path of Exile has one of the most full and well-developed endgame systems of any game out there. The mapping system, again, which is going to get its own video, is truly interesting and unique. And it gives you its own sense of progression. As you work through the maps, you've constantly got this goal in sight, and you're aiming for that goal. So it doesn't feel like you're pushing higher numbers just for the sake of pushing higher numbers. You're pushing higher numbers to accomplish something. And currently that something is slaying an Uber Elder. That is currently the big ultimate goal of the end game right now, is the defeat of Uber Elder. And then, recently, they said, you know, some players really do just really like grinding away that higher number, really like trying to do better each time. And so they introduced the Delve. Delve brought with it an endless dungeon that you can now try to push deeper and deeper into, trying to see how far you can take your build. Now, right now, that is currently set up in a way that certain builds are better at delving than others, just as there are certain builds in Diablo 3 that are better at greater rift pushing. But right now, the build diversity for true depths pushing is still a little shallow, but I have a feeling that will improve with time. As almost all systems in Path of Exile have improved with time, as grinding your games continues to put more and more effort into the game. But in addition to just pushing for numbers, Delve brings with it its own unique rewards as well. So this allows you to not have to choose one or the other. You can use Delve as its own mechanic to help you progress and get the gear you need to take on the super bosses. In addition to that, you've got all kinds of boss runs. You've got running the Uber Labyrinth, trying to get the best labyrinth times so that you can earn the special jewels. You've got the challenge leagues and trying to complete all of the challenge in the challenge leagues to get free cosmetic rewards. But also, one fun thing that exists in the endgame is, once again, that crafting, that big boy crafting. You can make endgame all about trying to create the best, coolest gear you can possibly make. So you've got multiple goals you can work through to endgame, and all of them have very interesting systems tied into it. And again, I'll get into that in its own video when I talk about all of the different endgame systems that currently exist in Path of Exile. So hopefully, going point by point like that, I've shown you all of the many ways in which Path of Exile takes what Diablo II created and pushes it further to try to make a game specifically aimed at, hopefully, the people watching this video. Hopefully you are one of those action RPG, computer RPG fans, and I hope you will give Path of Exile a try so that you can see just how much this game actually was geared towards you. When Grinding Your Games made Path of Exile, they chose us as its audience, and they have done everything they can to make it the game that we want to play. And to this day, they're still actively communicating with the community so that we can have a better and better Path of Exile experience with each league. Diablo 3, as I said, Diablo 3 was aimed to be a mainstream game. It was aimed to pull in as many gamers, fans of as many genres as possible. And that's fine. But the simple fact of the matter is that a game, movie, book, whatever you want, with a full mass market appeal is never going to feel as unique and directed towards you as a game that chooses a specific audience. So if you like that idea, if you don't like the idea of playing a more gothic feeling game, if you don't like the idea of playing a game that can be very punishing, if you don't like the idea of making a character that might not be viable for all content, then yeah, Diablo 3 really is the game for you. And it's still a lot of fun. Every time I go back and play Diablo 3, I still have fun. I get tired of the endgame grind after a while, but every time I go back to it, I still find plenty of enjoyment. It's always worthwhile for me to play it again. So just because that's the game you want does not mean that you are not a true fan or anything like that. It just means that you don't want to have to put up with some of the things that are inherent with Path of Exile's experience. You just want to play a fun game. And Diablo 3 is that fun game. But if you're like me, and you do like putting a lot of thought and planning into your character, and you do like having strong risk-reward systems, and you do like a game that will punish you for your mistakes, and you like a game where you feel like you're always striving to do better and become a better player of that game, then I think Path of Exile is up your alley. So, if you're like me, if you are a classic action RPG fan, you're a classic computer RPG fan, and you love obsessing over games, I really do recommend that you try Path of Exile. Again, it technically isn't a better game than Diablo 3, but it might just be the better game for you. This is Divine Erdrick, and I hope to see you all in Rayclast.